When I first arrived in the small, quiet town, I thought it was exactly what I needed. A fresh start, away from the noise and chaos of city life. The house I rented sat on the outskirts, surrounded by dense woods that whispered in the wind. It was old but charming, with creaking wooden floors and an ornate mirror left behind by the previous owners. The mirror hung in the hallway, its heavy, antique frame almost seeming out of place in the otherwise modest home. At first, everything seemed fine. The neighbors, while polite, were oddly reserved when I mentioned the house. They'd exchange glances, their smiles growing thin. One elderly woman, after a long pause, simply said, "Sometimes, things are best left alone." Her words stayed with me, though I didn't know why at the time. It didn't take long before the strange occurrences began. At night, I'd hear faint creaks coming from the floorboards, even when I was sitting perfectly still. The air in certain rooms felt colder, heavier, as if someone was standing just behind me. Once, I swore I heard faint whispers, but when I turned, there was no one there. I laughed it off as paranoia, telling myself that an old house naturally makes noises. But the mirror, it was different. It seemed to have its own presence. Every time I passed by, I felt an urge to glance at it, and each time, it left me with a gnawing unease I couldn't explain. One night, as I was brushing my teeth, I could have sworn I saw something in its reflection. Not behind me, but deep within the glass, a shadow, faint and fleeting. I told myself it was just a trick of the light, but it left me shaken. The unease grew. At night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. My bedroom, which should have been a place of comfort, began to feel like a trap. The worst part, I could never pinpoint what was wrong. There was nothing tangible to blame, just the creeping sensation that I wasn't alone. And then, one night, I noticed something I couldn't ignore. The shadows in the mirror. They didn't match the objects in the room. It was subtle at first, like a trick of the eye. But as I stared, I realized the shadows were moving, shifting, even though nothing in the room had changed. I quickly turned off the lights and crawled into bed, trying to convince myself it was all in my head. But deep down I knew something was wrong with this house, and whatever it was just getting started. The next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled over me. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of shadow in the corners of my vision set my nerves on edge. The mirror had become the centerpiece of my unease. I decided to cover it with an old sheet, thinking it might help. Out of sight, out of mind, or so I hoped. But the unease didn't leave. In fact, it got worse. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard the faintest tapping sound, like fingernails on glass. At first, I thought it was coming from the window, but when I turned my head, I realized the sound was coming from the hallway, the mirror. My heart raced as I stared at my bedroom door, half expecting it to creak open on its own. The tapping continued, rhythmic and deliberate, until it suddenly stopped. Sleep was impossible after that. When the sun finally rose, I threw the sheet off the mirror and stared at it, as if daring it to do something in broad daylight. It reflected my tired, haggard face and the hallway behind me. Nothing seemed out of place, but as I turned to walk away, I could have sworn I saw the faint outline of a handprint on the glass, almost as if someone had pressed their palm against the other side. That was when I decided to do some digging. I walked into town and visited the local library, hoping to find any information about the house. The librarian, a woman in her 60s with sharp, watchful eyes, hesitated when I mentioned the address. "That house," she said, lowering her voice. "It's been empty for years. No one stays there long. Strange things happen." She pulled out a dusty folder from the archives. Inside were old photographs and newspaper clippings about the previous owners. The most recent article was from 10 years ago. A man had gone missing, vanished without a trace. His wife claimed he'd become obsessed with the mirror, often talking to it as if it were alive. She eventually left the house, claiming it was cursed. My stomach churned as I read the article. The date of his disappearance was exactly 10 years ago to the day. When I returned home, I couldn't bring myself to go near the mirror. I avoided the hallway altogether, sticking to the living room and kitchen. But that night, As I was washing the dishes, I heard it again, the tapping. It was louder this time, more insistent. My chest tightened as I slowly made my way toward the hallway. The air felt thick, oppressive, as if I were wading through water. When I reached the mirror, I stopped dead in my tracks. The sheet I'd thrown over it earlier was crumpled on the floor, and in the glass, there was no reflection of the hallway behind me. Instead, there was darkness, deep, impenetrable darkness, as though the mirror was no longer a reflection, but a window into something else. Then the whispers began. The whispers were faint at first, like the soft rustling of leaves in a breeze, but they grew louder with each passing second, taking on a rhythmic cadence, a language I couldn't understand. It wasn't just sound, it was something more. It felt like the words were crawling under my skin, like tiny insects burrowing into my mind. I stood frozen in front of the mirror, staring into the void it now reflected. My breath hitched as I realized the whispers weren't just in my ears. They were in my head. My thoughts felt muddled, as if the whispers were blending with my own inner voice, trying to take control. I backed away, my legs shaking, and ran into the living room. I grabbed my phone and dialed my friend Marcus. Marcus was a skeptic, the kind of person who always sought logical explanations for everything. I needed his grounded perspective. "You need to come over," I said, my voice trembling. "Something is wrong with the mirror." "A mirror? Seriously?" he replied, clearly unimpressed. "Are you sure you're not just tired or imagining things? You've been under a lot of stress lately. Just come over," I pleaded. "Please. I need someone else to see this." He sighed, but agreed. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. The wait for Marcus felt like an eternity. I sat in the corner of the living room, facing away from the hallway, refusing to look in the mirror's direction. The whispers had stopped, but the air still felt heavy, charged with an unnatural energy. I noticed small details around the house that I hadn't before. Scratches on the walls, faint discolorations on the ceiling, as if something was seeping through the structure itself. When Marcus finally arrived, I practically dragged him inside. "It's in the hallway," I said, pointing. "You need to see it." He followed me reluctantly, muttering something about how ridiculous this all was. But the moment he laid eyes on the mirror, his expression changed. He stood there, staring, his face pale. "What the hell?" he whispered. The mirror wasn't reflecting the hallway anymore. It wasn't even showing the void I had seen earlier. Instead, it displayed a distorted version of the room we were standing in. The walls were warped, and the furniture looked decayed, as though decades of neglect had passed in an instant. But what truly froze us both were the figures standing in the reflection. There were two of them, tall and faceless, their bodies gaunt and impossibly thin. They wore tattered clothing that seemed to shift and writhe, as though alive. One of them slowly raised a hand, pressing it against the glass. I felt an icy chill run through me as I noticed something horrifying. The handprint matched the one I had seen earlier. Marcus stepped back, his voice shaky. This isn't possible. It's some kind of trick, right? A projection or something." Before I could respond, the whispers returned. They were louder now, deafening, and this time, Marcus could hear them too. He clutched his head, groaning in pain. "Make it stop," he yelled. I grabbed his arm, pulling him away from the mirror. "We need to get out of here," I shouted over the cacophony. But as we turned to leave, the whispers stopped abruptly. The silence was even more terrifying than the noise. I glanced back at the mirror. The figures were gone, and the reflection was normal again. Marcus and I stood there, breathing heavily, neither of us daring to speak. The oppressive energy lingered, wrapping around us like a suffocating blanket. "I'm not staying here," Marcus finally said, his voice firm. "You need to leave this house. Tonight." I nodded, but deep down, I knew it wouldn't be that simple. The mirror had a hold on me, and I wasn't sure if I could break free. I didn't sleep that night. After Marcus left, I packed a bag and sat in the living room, waiting for the first rays of sunlight to pierce the darkness. I wanted to leave, I really did, but something held me back. The mirror. It felt like it was calling to me, even from the other room. By morning, exhaustion and paranoia had taken their toll. My mind raced with questions. Was I going crazy? Was this just some elaborate hallucination? Or was there something far more sinister at play? I needed answers, but I wasn't sure where to start. I decided to do some research. I pulled out my laptop and began scouring the internet for anything that could explain what I had seen. Urban legends, supernatural forums, obscure occult websites. None of it offered anything concrete. But then I stumbled upon a thread on an old paranormal forum. The title sent a shiver down my spine, The Haunting Mirror Phenomenon. The post described stories eerily similar to mine. People who had acquired antique mirrors, only to find themselves plagued by whispers, shadowy figures, and distorted reflections. One account stood out. A man claimed the mirrors were gateways, a link between our world and another, one darker, filled with entities that fed on fear and despair. His last message was chilling. Once the mirror chooses you, there's no escape. I slammed the laptop shut, my heart pounding. It couldn't be true. It just couldn't. But deep down, I knew it was. I could feel it, like a cold hand gripping my soul. The rest of the day passed in a haze. I avoided the hallway entirely, not daring to glance at the mirror. But as night fell, the oppressive energy returned, heavier than before. It pressed down on me, making it hard to breathe. And then the whispers began again. This time, they weren't faint. They were loud, insistent, like a chorus of voices all speaking at once. I covered my ears, but it didn't help. The sound was inside my head, reverberating through my skull. "Come back," they said. "Look." I clenched my fists, fighting the urge to obey. But the pull was too strong. My legs moved on their own, carrying me down the hallway, step by step, until I was standing in front of the mirror. The glass shimmered, like the surface of a pond disturbed by a stone. And then I saw it, myself. But it wasn't me. The reflection was twisted, warped, like a funhouse mirror brought to life. My eyes were sunken, my skin pale, and stretched tight over my bones. And I was smiling, an unnatural, horrifying grin that sent a jolt of terror through me. "Is this what you want?" the reflection asked, its voice blending with the whispers. "To see the truth?" I stumbled back, shaking my head. "No, this isn't real. You're not real." The reflection's grin widened, splitting its face in two. "Oh, but I am. And you invited me in." The lights flickered, plunging the hallway into darkness. I scrambled to turn them back on, but the switch wouldn't work. My phone's flashlight provided a dim, shaky glow as I backed away from the mirror. But then I heard it, a sound that froze my blood. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from behind me. I spun around, shining the flashlight into the darkness. Nothing, just an empty hallway. And then I saw it, a shadow tall and thin, standing just at the edge of the light. Its form was indistinct, shifting like smoke, but its eyes, glowing, piercing eyes, were fixed on me. I ran. I didn't think. I didn't look back. I just ran, out of the house, into the night, the cold air biting at my skin. I didn't stop until I reached my car, slamming the door shut and locking it behind me. But even as I sat there, trembling and gasping for breath, I knew it wasn't over. The shadow wasn't in the house anymore. It was with me, and it wasn't going to let me go. I don't remember driving. I only recall the overwhelming need to flee, to put as much distance between myself and that thing as possible. My hands trembled on the steering wheel, and my eyes darted to the rearview mirror constantly, terrified of what I might see. Every shadow along the roadside seemed alive, stretching and twisting toward me, as if the entire world was conspiring to trap me. I ended up at a motel far outside town, the kind of place that didn't ask questions. The clerk, a tired-looking woman in her 50s, barely glanced at me as she handed me the key. "Room 12. I muttered a thank you, my voice shaking, and hurried inside. The room was small and smelled of mildew, but it was a sanctuary compared to the nightmare I'd left behind. I locked the door, slid the chain into place, and shoved the dresser in front of it for good measure. Only then did I collapse onto the bed, my heart pounding like a drum. For a while there was silence. No whispers, no footsteps, no shadows creeping at the edges of my vision. I began to think, hope, even, that I had escaped. But deep down I knew better. It started with a knock, soft at first, almost polite, as if whoever, or whatever, was on the other side wanted to lull me into a false sense of security. I froze, staring at the door. The knock came again, louder this time, more insistent. "Who's there?" I managed to croak, my voice barely above a whisper. No answer. I reached for my phone, my fingers fumbling as I dialed Marcus's number. It rang once, twice, then went straight to voicemail. I tried again and again, but the result was the same. It was as if the world had cut me off, leaving me alone to face whatever horror was stalking me. The knock turned into pounding, the door rattling in its frame. I backed away, clutching the phone like a lifeline, my breath coming in shallow gasps. And then it stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating, heavy with the promise of something worse. I didn't dare move. I didn't even breathe. And then the lights flickered. "No, no, no," I whispered, backing into the corner of the room. The air grew colder, my breath visible in the dim glow of the single flickering bulb. Shadows pooled in the corners, spreading like ink across the walls and ceiling. And then I saw it. The mirror. I hadn't noticed it before. Hanging above the dresser I'd shoved against the door. Its surface shimmered, rippling like water, and my reflection stared back at me. Not as I was, but as the twisted, grinning version I had seen before. "You can't run," it said, its voice a low, guttural rasp that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You invited us in. We are part of you now." The shadows coalesced, taking form in the middle of the room. The figure from my hallway stood there, tall and menacing, its glowing eyes fixed on me. Its presence was suffocating, an oppressive weight that pinned me in place. "What do you want?" I screamed, tears streaming down my face. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it raised a hand, long, skeletal fingers pointing toward the mirror. My reflection moved on its own, stepping closer to the glass until its face was pressed against it. And then it smiled. "Let us in," it whispered. The bulb shattered, plunging the room into darkness. I fumbled for my phone, turning on the flashlight, but it barely penetrated the blackness. The shadow was gone. The mirror was gone. Everything was gone. And then, in the glow of the flashlight, I saw my reflection, not in a mirror, but standing right in front of me, its twisted grin inches from my face.